Countdown in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Mr. Nick Warren, welcome to CamTalks.
Oh, hello. How are you?
Hello, Nick. I am just glorious. It's a wonderful day.
Yeah, no, it's good, isn't it? Yeah.
Where are you right now, Nick?
So we live just about 3 miles outside of Winchester. So
wonderful. I didn't know that. I actually didn't know. I used to live in Winchester.
oh, did you?
Yeah, or actually
No way.
Chandler's Ford, which is actually just a little hop over that way. But ex-girlfriends were in Winchester mostly.
Well, we're closer to Chandler's Ford than we are to Winchester. So we're just in Romsey. So
there you go. Jesus Christ. We haven't even been on for 1 minute, Nick, and we're already finding out more about each other. Well, look, Nick, why don't you just give us a quick little overview of who you are and kind of how we met?
Yeah, how did we meet? Well, we were introduced by Thomas, weren't we? So, okay, so my story is in 1997, I was working in IBM and I had a bit of a temper tantrum and I left IBM and sort of accidentally started a web agency because that's sort of what you did. I'd been working in for IBM's new media lab and web was big. It was massive, you know, just coming into the dot-com kind of boom. And I started this business almost by accident, really. And it was exactly at the right time to accidentally start that kind of a business. And lo and behold, sort of 18 years and 2 recessions later, we were still going. We had clients around the world, UK, Europe, Asia, America. And, you know, it was a good business. It was a good business. But I just got to the stage where I wasn't really, do you know what? I was 45. This is 2015. I was 45. And you get to a point where you think, do I want to be doing this forever or like for the rest of my work?
Or another 2 decades?
Yeah. And the answer was no, I don't really. So sometimes you've got to make a big decision, haven't you? You've got to make a big change. And what actually happened in 2016 is that I got one of my guys to take over as MD. And I kind of just started working from home, writing thrillers, which is the biggest difference you can possibly imagine from running a company. And I did it in quite a business-like way. I thought I'll write a short one, I'll put it out for free on Amazon, and I'll just see what response it gets. And so that book, if you count up all the reviews around the world, it's got over 1,200 5-star reviews, that book. So, you know, I thought then there's something interesting here. There's something I can do, and I'm going to write more. And I've now written three novels. But it's a very, very definition of a long-term business plan. Writing books, I mean, you know, it's like art. It's like your stuff now. If you do art, you have to expect not to be paid, and you have to expect to do it for the love of it. And I guess, I mean, I sold my business. I sold that business in 2018, and did well. But I've got a house, I've got a mortgage, I've got 2 teenagers, so the money will run out. The money will run out, and you get that. So I guess about a year ago, I thought, well, I'm loving writing the books, but what I need to do is build another kind of a business. And the interesting thing was, it's funny really, the more I got into the craft of stories and storytelling, writing these thrillers, the more I realized that really I'd been doing that all along to run the business. Because, you know, I wasn't a designer, I wasn't a coder. We never had any salespeople. We never made any cold calls. We never placed any ads. What we did was really good work, and then sort of told stories about that work, I suppose. And then in time, our clients started telling stories about us to other people. And that's how the business rolled on. It's still going now, you know, over 20 years later. And so one of the things that I've started to do in the last year is work with people, businesses, you know, or individual clients, to help them tell a better story. And I've really got into this idea that I guess people who tell better stories get better lives overall. So I've got kind of 2 sides, I guess, to what I do now. One is the kind of a free sort of social side. I put a lot of content out into the world, a podcast every day, and it's really strategy, copywriting, and story structure. And the other side of my business is more commercial. Stories Mean Business is a consultancy really that helps people tell better stories about themselves, their beliefs, their companies, or whatever.
Incredible. Listen, Nick, this is amazing because as a storyteller myself, it's very rare that you find someone that actually says that story is their life, that this is what I'm good at. And the fact that you kind of fell into a web agency, you survived the dot-com boom, you were the first storytellers that were really commercializing people's business, or commercializing their story in a sense. The colors, the fonts that you choose for someone's website don't maybe have much of an effect anymore compared to the other communications tools we have. But back then, that must have been something, just trying to come up with someone's identity in a website.
I think, well, taking brands online, when I started on the web, it was grey background and black lines. I mean, that's what you had, so that evolution of taking the brands online and being able to bring design, but also personality. I mean, this is what so many businesses lack, of course, personality. And we were lucky to work with big brands in kind of entertainment and what have you, or visitor attractions, like say the London Dungeon, for example. We work with dungeons all around the world who have an amazing personality. Their brand has an amazing personality, and the chance to bring that into the website is really exciting. And actually, as a storyteller, you can write a privacy policy in two ways, right? You can copy and paste the legalese, or you can do that and put some personality in there, put some story in there. And that was the kind of thing that we were doing. Because although I guess I wasn't a designer and I wasn't a coder, I have always been a writer, a copywriter. And so that was that was the thing I added, I suppose. And if you think about what the web is and what storytelling is, they're both so much about structure. They are both about how are we structuring this story, this website, this menu, so that the users can get what we want them to get out of this thing. And structure is one of those skills that we never see on a CV, but being able to put your thoughts in order to make them clear to other people is so important. And it's a real core part of storytelling, or indeed filmmaking.
Well, that's why I absolutely love like the modern day, because it seems like people like yourself were like pioneers of, storytelling for businesses. And then over the years, the UX UI designer, became like this a really important mystical creature that could come in and create a customer journey like no other. But in the end, you think, well, you're just a storyteller. Storyteller is not a title that we have, regarded in our society. It's just not. And yet, maybe I don't know whether you consider this, but like, think of all the caveman days, and there's like spiritual people that was always like by the side of the king or something, and it's not necessarily that they know more, or they could tell a good story. They could spin that story for whoever they need, and yet storytelling is not a profession. What's that about?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, of course, stories are where we've stored historically so much of our kind of cultural wisdom, I think. And an awful lot of it, of course, is in religion, it's in mythology, it's in those things, but it's not traditionally been thought of as business because you can't really measure it. The closest we have, I guess, is brand in the last sort of 30 years. Is how do we want people to think about our business? And of course, one of the things about brand is you want it to sort of ring the same note wherever you hit it, whether it's a website or in a shop or whatever. You want it to feel the same. And I think it's really interesting what you say about the kind of the professionalism of it. I mean, if we're talking about building websites and what have you, the branding element of that is so much more important, because if well, think about it this way: if you've got a website, actually, yes, we're telling stories, but your customer, your client, is telling themselves a story as well. So when you can click on a website and it doesn't do what you think it's going to do, that's because we've violated the story you were expecting, right? And this is part of what I do now. It's this idea that when we, as a business, we make an offer. Essentially, when we make an offer, our client is telling themselves a story about what their life will be like if they did this thing. Say we're offering a course for 500 quid, or you're doing a film for 500 quid. The client's going, in their head, they're going 500 quid versus what my life will be like. And they're telling themselves a story, right? And, that I tend to call that the sort of the front story, whereas the back story is what they think about you, Cam, and your ability to deliver that thing. And that's, I guess, the thing that I'm doing most now with my clients is helping them write stories that build that sense of attention and trust and credibility.
It's interesting as well because you didn't have all these other platforms to put content on back in those days, right? Could you even put a video on a website?
Oh, that was no. Do you know what? The first time I ever saw a video online, proper video online, it was tiny postage stamp trailer for the awful Star Wars sequels. I don't know when they came out, but no, we couldn't. Flash was the most. I think I saw that in '97. I think a Flash animation on a web page, and it just was like game changing then. But video, no way. I mean,
Absolutely. And it takes these brands a long time to even see these platforms exist, right? And I think that's why, YouTubers, the early adopters are all now millionaires, and the brands had the opportunity to jump on that platform. But there's something about a corporation or a business that kind of that shared responsibility gives you no responsibility. It's like, actually, there's no one really that is going to take the blame for not innovating in storytelling. So it is interesting now that you've kind of sold your agency and now you're kind of going back into the world of business, but I guess doing it from more of a holistic point of view, something that not a lot of business owners have really been told. What's your story, and I think that's what got me, particularly recently with the whole coronavirus. It's like 50-page coronavirus policy statements is not what I need these days, and I think that's why what we're doing now, the ability to just talk, is so powerful. So tell me, what's been the sort of challenge working with business owners or business leaders? How hard has it been to get them to, let's say, be honest about themselves and their story?
I think once you get them in the room, it's surprisingly easy. People want to talk, and they want to talk about their lives. And one of the things that I do, I guess, I mean, it's definitely not therapy, but we are looking for conflict, because one of the challenges with most business communication and even brands, of course, is that we want to say that everything's fine or good or great or amazing. We never want to say that there's a problem. And from an evolutionary point of view, one of the reasons why we're wired for story is because they're a really low cost way of learning what might kill you or hurt you, right? So they're kind of like flight simulators for life. So one of the reasons why we're programmed to listen to stories is because the amygdala, the little part of our brain that is really focused on our survival, is always looking to see, can I learn something that might help me? And we're not just talking about running away from the saber-toothed tiger, of course. We're a social species. And, back on the plains of Africa, being cast out of a tribe would be the same as a death sentence, really. So we're really, as beings, we're really concerned about how other people's minds work and how, like right now, I might be thinking, what's Cam thinking about what I'm saying? But we're always trying to get inside other people's heads, and stories allow us to do that, really. And one of the reasons why business communication has very often so little attention paid to it is because there is no conflict. And you think about it from the evolutionary point of view, if what you're telling me has no conflict in it, then the amygdala can't learn anything that it thinks is useful. Yeah. If you tell me a story about walking down the road, it's not ever going to trigger anything. If you say I was walking down the road and I saw a snake, because we've got circuits that are 100,000 years old that make us watch out for snakes because they used to be in the trees with us. You know what I mean?
But that's, of course, the opposite of what businesses want to do, right? They don't want to admit their failures. I mean, do you find it interesting when, obviously you've worked with personalities, and some people like Elon Musk, will go on to Joe Rogan's show, smoke a joint, and everyone cries out like, oh, this is terrible for Tesla. Have you seen the Tesla stock price recently?
Yeah. Well, so there are people reinventing how business should be, isn't it? And I'm doing my part of that in terms of just helping people be more honest, I guess, about their conflict. And that's one of the things. You asked what I was doing with people. It is, once you get in a room with people, they very often surprisingly want to talk about the things that have actually hurt them, because that's where they learn the thing that's made them successful. Yeah.
So if they're not sat in front of a computer trying to write their own story, they'll actually be honest talking to someone face to face.
Yeah, I think it's easier. And then you know, not every, I mean, I've had people tell me things that there's no way I'd put in their story because it's too much, it's too personal. But, you know, what you think, if you think about what I'm looking for my clients, they want a story that kind of uses the past as fuel to build whatever they're doing, you know. So very often we're looking for people who, well, they're looking for stories that will connect them to the people they want to work with in a more kind of real way. I hate the word authentic because as soon as you start to use it, you're automatically not authentic. But certainly that kind of connection, that human connection. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that companies struggle, because the things we need for story is really a kind of a character, a conflict, and a consequence. And you can't build a character really out of a business.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's why CEOs tend to be the founders of the company. You know, I mean, at least for the successful companies at the top, you know, you kind of have that association with the person that founded it. You know, I mean, it's quite terrifying, really. Like, I actually look at marketing in a very simple way because I'm a filmmaker first. And so, you know, having studied all these films and been to film school and stuff, entering the marketing world was just a bit bizarre. Didn't really understand why everyone was being so dishonest about things and why they were so afraid to show about, you know, who they are. And then, of course, I started helping business leaders, you know, like yourself, and doing that same sit down and tell me your story type thing. And suddenly you realize, well, none of that's on your website, or none of that's, you just told me a great story about how you started this company, and you're not willing to share that with people. So I guess the thing is it being fearless that they need to kind of, to, you know, build that confidence of just saying, hey, look, it's just the internet, right?
Yeah, I think you do need to be brave. And I think it's very difficult. I mean, for us, it's easy for us to judge the people who can't do that. But there are certainly people who could not be that honest. They just can't. And I know for a fact that there are CEOs out there who are kind of on the edge. They are kind of on the edge because their life is just insane. I mean, we think our lives are busy, but their lives are insane, you know, from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. at a minimum. And if they share that level of kind of stress, there would absolutely be a problem. And, you know, there would absolutely, you know, because they're bound to their shareholders, they're bound to their boards, you know, they're in a loop they can't get out of. So for me, I mean, you know, sadly for them, but for me, I'm certainly looking for the kind of clients who are capable of being honest, and that isn't everyone. I mean, I think, you know, if you happen to be a founder of a business, then you're perfect in a way, because I know this from starting my own companies, you know, that the company takes on the personality to a certain extent of the founder, of the people who run it. So, you know, very often that's quite a good thing. But if you're a solopreneur, you might manage to tell your story. Other people, it just depends. It depends what kind of business they're in and what kind of competitive environment they're in, I think. So it's not everyone.
And it's tough, right? Because all of their experience in the past tells them to not reveal these things. You know, it's like, we could be on the front page of a newspaper tomorrow for just saying that in a press conference. And now you're like, I mean, Jesus, like the world is so connected these days. And it's weird because, you know, you're with your agency, you know, you're being judged on that website, you know, but with personal brands and, you know, with social media, you're being judged on every tweet, every piece of content, every single thing you put out there, which I'm not surprised brands go, oh, we just can't control our own narrative to that extent. So, I mean, what was it that kind of, what was it that made you leave the agency world? Obviously, you said that, you know, it was a revelation that this wasn't kind of, you know, where you wanted to spend the next 2 decades or something. But, you know, going back to your roots, you know, were you always a storyteller? Did you always enjoy writing, or is this something that you developed with the agency?
I used to say when I was a kid, I used to say that I was going to write stories. That's what I was going to do. You know, like a young kid, I had a book of fairy tales when I was a kid, and I used to just dive into it, and I loved it. And I always wanted to do that. And I was one of those guys who said for 30 years, I could write a better story than that. And when in 2016, I decided I was going to step back from running the business, it was the first thing that came into my head, partly because one of the things was that Amazon and the Kindle meant that you could indie publish. So you didn't have to go through an agent, you didn't have to go through a publisher. You could just write something and put it out into the market. And that really, as a business person, that really appealed to me, because I didn't want to spend a year of my life writing something and finding out it was terrible, or that there was no audience for it. So I thought, right, I'll spend 3 months, I'll write this short thing, I'll put it out there and I'll see what happens. And, that's one of the examples of how technology really made that kind of dream practical, in a way. By the same token, of course, there's a massive amount of content out there, a massive amount of competition. And even with a book that's got loads and loads of good reviews, it's going to take a while to build the momentum to turn that into a career, really. But
it's really interesting, because you said that, when you were a child, you wanted to tell stories. Why didn't you, Nick?
Well, I did as a kid, but you couldn't go out and get a job. I didn't go to film school like you, but I did do a media studies degree, and in like 1988 to 91. And when we came out at 91, there were just no jobs. There were no jobs. I mean, even if, I suppose I could have written a book then, because I'd have made exactly the same amount of money, i.e. nothing. But I think I did have 20 years writing experience before I sat down in the chair and wrote the first paragraph of the first book. And even though it had been business related, and I know how many millions of words I wrote in those 20 years, but they all made a difference, and they made, they created my style.
But there's words, Nick, and then there's structure, and you've spoken about structure before, and I feel, I've been dyslexic all my life, but only now have decided to ignore that in my mind, and actually it's because of the amount of feedback my clients have sent me when they're like, yeah, Cam, 2 minutes into this, there's a spelling mistake. And so you're like, oh, you kind of get it in your head that you just can't afford to get this wrong. But something that I've always really inspired to understand more of is that structure of a story. And it's got nothing to do with the dialogue, nothing to do with, the characters. It's got everything to do with finding a essence of uniqueness. And I can't seem to find unique stories anymore, Nick. It seems like every story originates from some myth or some, other story. I mean, tell me, how is the history of storytelling? How do you see it from your point of view, playing, a role in the modern day?
Well, so about the hero's journey, I presume. So I read Joseph Campbell's book, Hero with 1,000 Faces, when I was, I think, about 25. And it's just one of those things that made you think, oh, of course, they're all the same. They are all the same. Stories are all the same. There's always a person. They always have a problem. And the story is about how they solve it, right? That is the fundamental kind of structure of a story. But it's a bit like saying all faces are the same, isn't it? They've all, we've all got eyes and nose and mouth and what have you. But there is bountiful, wondrous sort of fecundity in that. There's, with that simple structure, someone with a character with a conflict, and then there's a consequence. You can turn that into a million stories. And I think the really interesting thing about it is that when we do that, whether it's in business or anything else, we create value, we create meaning. Have you heard about the significant objects, guys? Have you heard that?
I've not, no.
All right, so let me tell you this.
Writing my notes down, go for it.
I think it's about 2009, some really clever guys in the US decided to do an experiment, right? So they went out and they bought 100 pieces of tat, basically. They went to yard sales and stuff. And I think they spent an average of about $1.50 on each one of these things. And it's things like old crappy ornaments and, books that were had broken backs and all this kind of weird stuff. And so they spent like $130 in total or something, I think. And then they put it on eBay. But what they did was they asked 100 writers to write little stories about those objects. Have you heard of this?
I have not heard of this, but it sounds genius.
Yeah, it is genius. So bear in mind, they weren't trying to say that the stories were about this particular thing. They were inspired by this particular thing. If you Google significant objects, you can see some of these things. I've got the book in the bookshelf behind me. And I think basically they increased the value of those things by like 1,700% in terms of the bidding, just by having these stories. They made like $2,300 or something.
Which wasn't the point to make lots of money, right? Just to prove the point of storytelling.
The point was, when we give meaning to things, they have value. So, for example, if I say to you, I've got a book of stories that's sort of old and knackered and has got no cover, you might think, well, that's not worth a lot. But if I say that this was the book that I had as a kid, and my favorite story in that book was Jack the Giant Killer, and then I tell you that my son is called Jack, the book's suddenly worth a bit more, right? In your head, it's worth a little bit more. And if I say to you, actually, it wasn't my book, it was my mum's book when she was a girl, it's worth a bit more. And if I say, actually, do you know what? It was actually my grandma's book when my grandma was born in 1904, and this book was published in 1912. Actually, can you see that book on the shelf behind me? That is that book.
Wow.
Right? And it's over 100 years old, that book, and I keep it here in this space because it reminds me of that kind of joy I had, that simple joy. Jack the Giant Killer is a terrible story. It's about a kid who wanders around Cornwall slicing up giants, people getting eaten. It's not a brilliant story, but that thing really lit me up when I was a kid. And that significant objects thing, or that story about the book, if I just handed you that book and didn't, or you came across it, you'd think this is knackered, and it is knackered. But then if I tell you that little story about what it means to me and my family, and you held it, you would hold it carefully, because the story has given it kind of value, if you like. And
it's on a nice stand as well. I think that you've kind of made the stand if I was going to rob your house, Nick, I'd probably steal that book, not even knowing what it was, and then I'd have to take
must have value.
Yeah, it must. It's there. Yeah. But do you know what's really interesting is that these conversations don't happen a lot. I don't see these conversations happening. We don't talk about the history of storytelling, and yet the exact analogy that you spoke about, being your grandma's book. We've kind of seen it now in a social media post out there somewhere. Someone's like, I found my grandfather's watch and I went to the Rolex dealer and he said it was knackered. And then he went to and so we understand why stories matter. But my question is, do you think it's got to do with some psychological sense of time commitment that the audience has given you? And it almost becomes a point of 10 minutes after hearing you speak about something, I'm just going to buy your shit anyway. Because actually then I will have lost 10 minutes of my life and not gained anything back in value. What do you think about that? Like the idea of keeping people on the gravy train for as long as possible, and then
what sort of wearing them out?
I wouldn't say wearing them out, but there's a reason why we watch 3.5 hours of Lord of the Rings, right? And it's because we're incredibly invested into it. And my thoughts is that actually maybe if you can keep people invested into your story long enough, you can sell them anything you want. That's kind of the route to becoming a super fan, is how many hours of that person have you watched?
Right. Okay.
Because I think that there's probably a lot of YouTubers out there that I've bought merch off and I don't even wear merch. Do you know what I mean? I just bought it because I want to support them.
Yeah. So you've got a relationship with them even though they don't know who you are, right? So this is interesting. One of the things that happens, if you tell a story well, you keep people interested. We do that usually by opening up sort of spaces, gaps in people's minds, by asking a question that they then need to know the answer. And if you take Lord of the Rings as an example, there's several questions opened up from the very first scene to the very last one. What's going to happen next? This is the thing we always, when I'm writing a thriller, this is the thing, it's at the front of my mind. I want the reader to go, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? If they do that for 400 pages, I've won, right? And what happens is, if we pay attention to a story long enough, we have something that psychologists called, which we're transported. So we become part of that world. We become, in some sense, the character, right? And that happens chemically. Good stories, a well-told story will release cortisol in your brain. It will release oxytocin, adrenaline. We feel stories deeply, partly because we've adapted over the centuries, the millennia, to use them, like I said, as these kind of flight simulators. So in some sense, if you can keep someone's attention for long enough, they will become you in the story. Particularly, I mean, one of the things I do with clients, of course, is because they're talking about what's difficult, they are automatically more sympathetic, because no one's had an easy life. I mean, it doesn't matter how lucky you are, you've had problems, and finding out that the other people in the world, the people that maybe you admire, or maybe, yes, you might be buying something from them, have also had problems, it brings us all kind of closer. Yeah. And, I was talking to a chap this morning who runs a really successful high-end executive consultancy that he coaches and places executives in, really big companies. And, he's had in many respects, I guess you might say, quite an easy life. But when we talked, he said at one point, I think there was stuff that happened between the ages of 5 and 15, which really shaped the way I've come to run my business. And you think, and I know what that is. That's conflict. There are things that happened in his life that are still resonating now. And I think, if we work together and we tell that story for a certain number of his clients, that will make a big difference. So I think it is important to say that there are some people, and there are plenty of transactions where the story is never going to matter. Some people are going to, if I've got a bleeding neck, I'm going to buy your bandage, whether you tell me a story or not, right? I need it. I want it right now. But, if we're talking about conversion and sales, there's a certain percentage of people who will feel much more comfortable buying from you if they can actually trust you, know you, like you, feel connected to you, because you become a 3D person rather than this kind of success guru. I get everything right, which is the thing that people, we feel like we should project by default, I think.
I love that analogy, Nick. Like, me bleeding out my neck. It's I wouldn't like to think of it myself, but just the idea of red blood pouring out of someone's neck, like, you're not going to ignore that, and there's something about the evolution of human beings that instantly wants to protect those that it can. But what I find interesting as well is that there's like the real world, and then there's like the story world. And we've been brought up with stories, and that's, as we've spoken about, how we learn things. But then there's the real world that doesn't follow story structure, doesn't follow story beats. And so my big worry about the future of all of us is that with the ability for us to tell stories, maybe there's a large majority of people that don't feel like that is their life, and they don't feel like that is mine. And I almost feel like ignorance to story structure and storytelling in general is going to make a lot of people feel almost a little bit scared of the modern world, a little bit scared to be themselves, to be authentic. I mean, how do you feel that we're going to deal with those pressures? Because I hate going on LinkedIn because everything's bloody great. Everything's fine. Good News Gazette, inspirational here, inspirational there. And I just don't really like, I look at television and film and that's like the grail for me. And I'm like, well, why aren't people bringing that conflict into places like LinkedIn? And they're just putting out lots of content around, I guess, how to make content. And they're the people that I watch, right? It's definitely not the same as getting a captivated audience, because the other argument is this, Nick. It's like, what's the retention rate of a movie? Where it's like, it's near enough 100%, right? Whereas like we marketeers struggle to get like 12% retention to the end. So there's like this absolute disconnect. And maybe it is the authors of the story, the authors of the content that just aren't good enough,
Well, I think we do have to look at what works in story if we want to sell our ideas, or ideas, products or services. It's the same thing, isn't it? It's, can we keep people's attention long enough to get some connection? If we get some connection, can we build some empathy and some credibility and some trust and all those kind of things? In other words, if you're making an offer, I might think about the story of my life and think, what will my life be like? And if I think, yes, my life will be better, I've next got to tell myself a story about you. Can Cam really deliver what he says he's going to deliver? And that's where your story would come in. And I think, in answer to your question, there are people on LinkedIn who are more comfortable sharing truth, or at least, I think we need to be honest, because stories the world is complicated, right? The world is complicated, and any story that we tell is by definition a simplification of what is a very complicated world. It's one of the issues, narrative fallacy. You've heard of narrative fallacy?
I've not, no.
Right. Okay. So another note for you then. As human beings, we're desperate to understand the world for reasons that I've said. And in general, we jump to conclusions. And in general, from a survival point of view, jumping to conclusions is the right thing to do, because usually we're right. Okay. If you hear the saber-toothed tiger growling, you want to run. You don't want to think, I wonder if that's a saber-toothed tiger. You want to just be gone. But it does open us up to what's called the narrative fallacy, which is we tell stories that simplify the world and make them make sense, even if those stories aren't true. And, so for example, let me give you a quick example. I've been writing copy for a couple of clients over the last week. And in both cases, the copy has gone up and almost immediately they've had a win, quite a significant win. And they've both written to me and said, oh, the copy's amazing. It's already working. And one of them was like 10 or 12 grand's worth of business off the back of an email that I wrote for this guy. And the narrative fallacy is we put the copy live and then there was an order. One thing led to another. But of course, we don't know that, right? Just because something happened and then something else happened doesn't mean they're connected. And it may well have been that this 10 or 12,000 pound order, the guy was about to push the button, whether he'd have seen that particular email or not. So one of the things we need to do as business people is test our assumptions, like I tested the first book. We need to say, let's see what happens over the longer term. And I think to your point about should we be worried about the world, I think it's really easy for all of us all the time, particularly now in this social media world, to think that these things have never happened before. We've never had the kind of leaders we've got around the world have never existed before. Well, of course, there have been dirtbag leaders, for as long as there have been human history, right? And I think it's really easy to think this is the worst time ever, or this is the best time ever. And of course, it's just another time. We have to always, like with these orders from my clients, we have to step back, take a long-term view, and you'll probably find a lot of this sort of stuff has happened before. I mean, it's like people complaining about teenagers. You can find diaries from 1700 where people say, oh, the world's going to hell in a handcart. We're never going to make 1800. Do you know what I mean?
So I guess the question is it possible to write an original story?
I think it definitely is possible to write an original story, but very likely the structure that, anyone who knows story structure is going to look at it and go, yeah, okay, I can see this character has got this problem, and then this is those fundamental things. But again, it's like saying, can you have an original human face? Everyone is original, even though they're all built of the same, they're built of the same material, right?
I like that, Nick. I mean, that's been a real bug for me for my whole life, is wanting to tell an original story and forever being told by, my screenwriting mentors or people around me that you can't write an original story. Everything's been done. And for someone like myself who really wants to have a challenge, I'm like, no, we're going to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, I'll quickly show you this. This is one of my favorite books, 7 Basic Plots.
Yes, that's in the bookshelf behind me, actually.
Oh, mate. Well, first of all, I didn't really know any of these myths that are in that book. The myths and legends that I grew up with Disney, obviously, are not the real, or not the original, should I say. And when I started finding out the original stories behind all of these things, I started thinking, wow, Disney have literally simplified,
Yes, yeah.
But at the heart of it is a story that has characters, and you said it earlier, characters, conflicts, and
consequence is the third thing. In other words, so if you've got a character just standing on their own, you haven't got a story. If they've got a problem, well, I tend to see that as the hook. If what would it be? If I said, well, I'm melting in this house, and the window panes are melting, I've got this problem, and that's a hook. What happens next? The consequence part of it is obviously, how does it work out? So, and if you think about what we talked about earlier on with the evolution of storytelling and why it works, if we want the amygdala to be satisfied, we have to try and tell it the solution to the particular problem. So from a survival point of view, it's learned something.
Interesting. So look, how important is it for non-story people to learn about story structure?
I think if you want to communicate with other human beings, it's really useful.
So basically everybody.
If you're like, listen, I think one of the things is we are coded for it anyway. Our brains, our neurology is coded for it anyway. So everyone tells stories. The problem is if you say someone sit down and write a story, they kind of freeze. And I think what structure gives you is a really simple way of saying, okay, well, there's a character and something's going to trigger them. Either they want something, which is a problem because they haven't got it, or someone's going to come along and take something that they need, and then they've got to, they were into conflict, and then they're going to have an insight. And if you can learn that kind of basic structure, I think it helps you create content that is more in tune with your audience, because you're wired for story, but it's not just you, it's your boss, it's your team, it's your prospects, it's your clients. So if you can learn it, just the basics of it, I think it really can help you you can look at a piece of communication and figure out why it's not working. There's no character, there's no conflict, there's no nothing, everything's fine. Like you said, everything's amazing. It doesn't work as a piece of communication if you want to engage people, transport them, like we talked about, and build that kind of attention, credibility, and trust.
It's really interesting as well, because the 3-act structure, good old Shakespeare, I think it was Shakespeare, or maybe it was not. Maybe it was actually, I think I actually read this the other day. It wasn't Shakespeare. It was another old guy. Well, they're all dead. But like the point is that there's something about these threes, or there's something about beginning, middle, and end that, set up, conflict, resolve, that if we don't get the resolve, it's not a story. We just saw like a situation, right?
Yeah. So I think Shakespeare was 5 acts actually. It was to do with the length of the candles. They had to relight the candles every so often in the theatre.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. There's a really good book called Into the Woods by John York.
Yes.
Have you read it?
Yes. Yeah.
So he talks about how actually, yes, there's lots of 5-act structures, 3-act structures, but you can overlay this 5-act structure onto them and they work quite as well. And it's one of the ways in which, if you're writing a thriller of 120,000 words like mine are, you want to make sure that the middle doesn't sag, right? So you have extra sort of tempos in the middle. And this isn't relevant, of course, for business, but that same idea of the character, the conflict, the consequence. That's
not,
really
Nick.
relevant.
I would actually argue that it is incredibly relevant for business. And one of the things that I got really excited about when I got into social media was the idea that I could actually create a story structure over a 12-month period, and that for a business, like, I could release content that was setting up who the business is, introducing another thing that they cared about, some sort of B story, and then literally showing the company starting to maybe not do so well, knowing full well that they're going to have their dark night moment and they're going to come back with a punch. And it's always just kept with me, because I think, well, if people are scrolling through social media every day and they see the same content from me every day, then that's not going to mean anything to them. But actually, over a 12-month period, if you stick with our brand and if you listen to the content we put out, you're going to feel in some way kind of more, you're going to have more relevance to that brand. What do you think about that? Like marketing.
I think so stories I think are good. It is a challenge if you're doing it over an extended period of time, because how many people are going to start the first bit, get to the conflict, and then not pick up the end, because you need the whole thing, particularly if it's about a business. And I think it's the kind of thing where let's say as artists, let's call ourselves artists, we need to have a better understanding of the practical implications of this kind of stuff for businesses, and the kind of businesses that would have the freedom and the creative sort of drive to do something like that, from my experience, will be few and far between. One of the problems we've got in society in general, of course, is that we're very focused on the short term, and the kind of thing that you just talked about, that the payoff is too far away probably for most businesses.
And too tough to measure, right?
Yeah, particularly if it's about a company.
Mm.
You know, you can, you know, if you think about TV advertising, you know, we're using. Well, I hardly see any TV advertising anymore, but I think about like coffee commercials when I was a kid. They're all using story, but they're not stories about the business. They're stories about characters who, in some sense, speak for the brand or embody the brand or whatever.
Mm.
But as I said earlier on, you have to have a story has to be about someone really rather than something,
Mm-hmm.
unless it's like unless it's like Buzz Lightyear over my shoulder here, which is, you know, anthropomorphized, you know, character. You know, that works, but you need to see them as a kind of a being, I think, and tough to do that with companies.
Absolutely, and I think that the thing that inspires me to want to try is just knowing that there's not a lot of companies that think like the artists, or there's not a lot of artists that think like a company, and so we end up having this world where, you know, I mean, I remember when I got into Facebook advertising around 2012, and you know, we're testing 70 different ads a month, and I'm having to make very tough decisions about which models are going to come back to the next shoot. And you know, part of me felt a bit bad about that. But then when the results of that creative got 2000% ROI and instead of 200%, suddenly I thought, well, actually, like, storytellers really need to know their audience and really need to know, you know, and if you can sort of split test these things, then
Oh
go.
yeah.
Tell me, how do you test your thriller? Is it how much people are sweating by the end of the book? The return on sweat?
Well, this is interesting. It's one of the, you can't, I mean, Amazon knows, for example, Amazon knows how many people drop out at each percentage on a Kindle, but they don't share that. I would love to know, as the businessman inside me would love to know, is there a point in the book? Maybe there's a point in the book where I drop people. Now, my thrillers are quite, they're quite cliffy. You know, there's a lot of pull through them. And I get a lot of emails from people who you know, love that kind of pull. But maybe there's a point in the book where I haven't got it quite right, and that's where people put it down and they get distracted and they're gone. But there's no way to know. There's no way to know. I mean, ultimately, the way to tell will be sales, of course. But you know, I've got 3 books, and I probably need 6 or 7 to make it work. And I take a long time over my stuff. So
Well, tell us a little bit about these books then. Are they a series of books, or are they all different stories? And what's the latest one?
They're what you call a man down a hole story. You know, so they're in the first book. My character is a psychologist. I tell you, do you know Jack Reacher?
I do, yes.
You might know him from the Tom Cruise films, but he's a very successful thriller writer, Lee Child. He's been writing these books for 20 plus years. And Jack Reacher is an ex-military kind of guy. He's huge. He's like 6'8", and he can. The basic premise is that he can beat up anyone he wants to, but he's also clever, right? And I thought, well, I love the style of these books, but I don't want to do someone who's military because there are just so many of these guys. So my character is a psychologist. He's a psychologist who, at the start of book 1, he lands in New York to commit a crime, actually, and he's in the wrong bar at the wrong time, and he gets sucked into this thing. And the idea for me was, because I'm really fascinated by psychology, you may have gathered, can I create a character who has a kind of a dark side, and he has this understanding of how people's minds work, and when he gets put into this terrible situation, which he is, can he use his knowledge of the human brain to get out of it and trick people? And you know, there's tension, there's violence, there's all these kind of things, but he's not a fighter. And it was really kind of a good test. And the novella that I wrote, that I tested, was him in this bar getting into the worst situation, really. You know, you have to talk to your characters. As a thriller writer, you talk to your characters, right? And it was about, could he get out or not? And that was the book that now has 1,200 plus 5-star reviews around. And that was called Execution. I then wrote Execution is Everything, which was a 120,000 word version of that. And then the second book came out, The Storm Beneath. And I'm working on the third one now. And it's kind of a continuing sort of story, but the arc will end. My 5-act structure, Cam, will end at the end of book 3. And then we'll see what the, what the readers want. But I mean, the feedback is lovely. And I tell you what, it's tricky to make a film in the way that you imagine it can be. But one of the joys of writing is that there's actually, you can do whatever you want. It may not be good and you may not ever quite be satisfied, but you can, these books are set in New York, and that's a wonderful canvas to have, and I do love that part of my life, I must say.
I love that as well, Nick. I think it's brilliant that, you're able to do business for such a long time, and then you're now able to get yourself in your office, sit down and just type away and let your creative juice flow. So tell me, is the character based any truths in that, with yourself? Do you see yourself as your protagonist? You're
No.
like
the only similarity is we both read a lot, and we're interested in the same things, but John, the character, he's 20 years younger than I am, and he remembers everything he reads, which I wish I'd done, after 50 years nearly reading. I think, there is always, your characters are in some sense you, in the sense that they are the best of you and the worst of you. And sometimes they're the character, the person you wish you were, I suppose. But no, I think this is one of the joys. Again, I guess it's like acting. You get to be in the heads of people who think differently and feel differently. And again, it's a massive joy of writing, I think. And whether it's a script, a film script, or a novel, you get that opportunity to be other people, which is rather wonderful, I think.
Absolutely. And I really love the fact that we're talking now, because I've just kind of reignited my writing passion, and watching hours and hours of interviews now with writers, which is actually really good, considering that's how I learn best. So I'm really thankful that all these writers are being able to share their knowledge via YouTube. And I heard the other day about the wells. So you heard about the wells. So you have like a memory well, you have like a movie well, and in those wells you put memories of your life, you put characters in movies that you like and movies that you like and all sorts of stuff. And this author, or this writer, described it as, when you're sat there looking at a blank screen, explore the different parts of your life that you really inspired you, or just the stuff that you kind of remember. And I guess since doing that, I've begun to realize that my taste in movies is probably bad for a filmmaker. I've got a lot of movies I just love. Marvel, like I love Pixar, I love Disney, and part of me just wants to, love Tootsie. I'm like, yes, I need to just go in and love that kind of stuff. But it's hard to be, to be a young person in a world that has got so many incredible writers, so many incredible creators, just to kind of come up with something that is you. I guess I'm finding it more introspective sort of thoughts coming out at this time, and kind of going back to the finding out about your life, having rewritten my own timeline every year that I've been alive. I just find it keeps changing, and I'm like, why didn't you mention that 2 years ago? And it's the story that you tell yourself that almost becomes who you are now, and in a very, very weird way, Nick, like the same epiphany that you had, after spending 20 years running an agency, I've kind of had now, but without the, I've been in business, but at the same time, I've never truly made anything as, something that strikes me about business is, it's like business is supposed to be fun, right? But what happens if you're an artist and you like doing art? You're suddenly like, well, am I supposed to just be poor forever? Or am I supposed to try a business? Or, I don't know, because there's so many opportunities available to us now. It's a bit.
I wouldn't say you should be poor forever. Well, yeah, that's you're going to end up with a miserable. We have to. I think one of the things that I always like that Steve Jobs quote. Real artists ship. We focus on our art, but in the end, if we want to do something, we have to actually put it out there. And I think, I have this conversation with my son, who's a dancer, and we can get really lost trying to find that one thing that, you're trying to find your voice. I was trying to find my voice. What we actually need to do is just do the work, put the work out there, and not worry about it being perfect, because it's never going to be perfect. And the way to get good is to be bad a lot, probably. If one of my novels is 120,000 words long, I probably wrote 500,000 words to get those 120,000 that I really like. And as I've said to you before, there are days when I can work for 8 hours and I end up with less than I had when I started. That is a bad day. But do you know what? The result is going to be better. So I think it's easy, particularly when there's so much. You can go onto any of the channels and there's genius stuff on there, right? And you think, it's no point in me doing anything unless I can do something as good as that. But this is the survivorship bias, because you don't see all the stuff that these people did before that got nowhere, right? So you have to. I'm a really strong believer in you have to do the work. You have to get a rhythm. You have to just keep going. Most of what success is stamina, and if you haven't got stamina, you're not going to learn how good you can be. That's the thing, I think.
I love it. Nick, we could talk about story like all day long. Before we go though, I just want to talk a little bit about games, because I know that you're an avid gamer.
Yes.
I know that The Last of Us has just come out. Was it 2 days ago?
Last Friday it came out, actually.
Why? How did you know that, Nick? Has that been in your diary?
For like 4 years. We talked about this, didn't we? I said to my family 4 years ago when they announced it, the day that game comes out, it's the sequel to my favorite ever game. The day that game comes out, I'm taking the day off work and I'm just going to draw the curtains and turn on the PlayStation. That's what I will be doing. If you could just leave my food by the door, that would be fine.
Oh.
And I still haven't finished it. I've done 30 hours since Friday morning, so I've been trying hard, but this work ethic is the same thing. When it came to Monday, I thought, no, I really must actually go and do some work for my clients now.
But tell me, the story structure and the plots, in games are just as magical and engaging as screenwriting or books, right?
Yeah, very often, I would say, very often, and this might be an example of that, more engaging than, so to take Last of Us as an example, this is set in a post-apocalyptic world. There's a kind of zombie plague. You might say, okay, well, that's just sort of normal. But one of the things you do is you wander around this world, which kind of was paused, if you like, in 2013 in the story world. We're kind of 30 years after that, almost 20, 30 years after that. And what you see is this decaying civilization. And in a game, you can look at all this intricate detail, which you'd never see in a movie, actually. And, we're picking up things, we're reading notes on walls, and we're getting insights into characters' lives who are long dead in the game world. And there's something rather, it's so immersive, actually. It's the kind of, with movies, you can get scale and you can also get intimacy between characters. But what we get in a game like this is 100 or 300 different little tiny vignettes. You come across a body, yeah, and you can see that the body's clutching a note or clutching a teddy bear or something, and there's all these like micro stories around it. So yeah, I do love games. I love this one in particular, and I have a very understanding family.
They must be very understanding, Nick.
Yeah, 30 hours and counting. Yes, they are.
Oh wait, well look, I don't want to keep you. I know that.
I've got.
More importantly, if you stop playing this game now, coming back to the point you raised about my master plan of God marketing, stretch out a story across a year. You do need to be in there, and be in the moment and be attached to this for as long as possible to get that, to get that release. So are you telling me that you're not going to stop playing it until it's completed?
Yeah, but well, essentially, I mean, I am working, and I am.
Just to know all your clients, I am actually working.
Yeah. But I've been stopping early every day this week because I keep thinking I'm near the end. I'm like, darling, I'm near the end. I'm just gonna only be a couple of hours, and then no, I'm not near the end. Sorry, no. But yeah, I mean, I want. It's that same thing. We want completeness. Yeah. So all the way through the game, we've got characters that we love already. We've got oodles of conflict, but what is going to happen? This comes back to the question. Why do we stick with communication? We need to be asking ourselves what's going to happen next. Otherwise, we don't stick. So the way to make your master plan work, you'd have to end every bit. Okay. Quick digression. Every story is not just character, conflict, consequence. It's lots of those little triangles. Yeah, they just get bigger and bigger. This is the kind of the fractal nature of stories. So for you, you'd have to make sure that every one ended on a cliffhanger enough to keep people coming back for next month. So that's the way you do that.
Oh, I absolutely love it. And I love the fact the gaming industry is like just so much bigger than like movies and everything. And yet it's just something about games that like, I mean, all people of all ages play them, but it's not like they get the same amount of attention as, the sort of Netflix and the Amazon of the world. And I don't understand why.
I think it depends what world you're living in. In my world, they get a lot of attention.
Well, there you go. We've all got different streams of consciousness and attention these days. Listen, I think I'm gonna go. I've got a couple of mates playing the game at the moment. They're both in individual bedrooms, their blinds shut. So I might just knock on. But
True believers.
Yeah, my mate came out the other day and he looked at me like, "Hello," and I'm like, "Right, are you okay? Has something happened?" He's like, "He just walked off." And I was just like, "Must be that game."
Sounds about right. Sounds about right.
Well, look, Nick, thank you ever so much for coming on the CamTalks show. It's amazing to have you in my life, and someone that I aspire to be like and look up to, mate. So thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah.
Where can people find out more? Obviously, we didn't touch that much on the Story Hacker podcast, but where at all? I'm looking at my notes right now, Nick, and I'm just like, I don't think I can write.
We just had a chat. It's fine. If you're interested, you can look up Story Hacker podcast. About almost 300 episodes into that. You can go to storiesthatmeanbusiness.com and or you can find my thrillers at nickwarren.com, all one word.
Amazing. And tell me, will these thrillers have an audiobook version for people like myself?
At some point, I hope so. But I need to find the right person, and finding the right person to voice this. Okay. We'll talk about that. That's a whole different story. We'll talk
Come
about
back for the next episode of the Nick and Cam show.
Maybe my worst cliffhanger ever, but there you are.
Well, Nick, thank you ever so much.
All right, mate. Take it easy.